Hi, my name is Craig Nelson. I am an elder in full connection of the Florida Annual Conference of the United Methodist Church. More succinctly, I am one of the pastors at First United Methodist Church of Boca Raton, Florida. I am preparing, I guess, 4 videos. In my mind, there are 3. There was an introductory one that I hope that you will take a look at. But this is the first of 3 videos that I want to have address the options that a United Methodist Church has once the decision around LGBTQ issues are settled in the denomination and in your annual conference, regardless of which one that might be. The title of all of this is What's Next for My United Methodist Church? What I'm thinking about is what happens in my local church. And I have served now a couple of United Methodist churches where there are awesome progressive people, there are awesome conservative people, and we live under the same roof and we worship together. And at some point, there is going to be a vote that we have to take in our church. Now, our bishop and his assistant do not agree with me on that, so let me tell you why I think there will be. When the General Conference changes the United States into a central conference, and that central conference eliminates the language around homosexuality in the Book of Discipline, then annual conferences will decide if they want to remain in what's called what the protocol calls the post-separation United Methodist Church. So the annual conference is going to decide if it's going to stay, and potentially there is no vote there. If the Episcopal office wants the annual conference to stay in the United Methodist Church, there doesn't have to be a vote. And so then if you want to remain there, theoretically, there's no vote taken in your church. But I know that in my church, when that happens, somebody's going to raise their hand and say, I think we should go to the Global Methodist Church. And that vote will become a referendum on the LGBTQ issue in my church. Conversely, if our church decides to remain in the United Methodist Church, what the Episcopal office has told us is that the default for the local church is that there are no LGBTQ weddings, and the pastor doesn't perform them, and they don't have to receive an LGBTQ pastor. Well, I can easily envision somebody in my local church raising their hand and saying, I think that we should allow for LGBTQ weddings in our church. And suddenly that will become a referendum on the LGBTQ issue in our church. And I think that we should, all of us, think about where do these bridges land us when we make a particular decision? What lies over there if we do one of these 3 things, which is to remain in the United Methodist Church, to go with an existing or a new offshoot of Methodism, or to go independent. So this first one is if you remain in the post-separation United Methodist Church, which just from the onset I want to say does not mean that you are going to keep the status quo. It's going to be a different United Methodist Church once they don't want to call it a split, once the division happens, whatever. What I would like to do is to organize my thoughts in an outline where there are several points: theology, polity, finances, pastoral appointments, and then the LGBTQ issue itself. And then I want to present some pros and cons, which are just my analysis of all of that, my own opinion. Not that any of this is fact, but anyway, I want to present that to you, and hopefully it will stir some discussion, and I hope that you will raise questions amongst yourselves and that it will lead to something healthy for your church. If you remain in the United Methodist Church, theologically, you will retain the inheritance of the Wesleyan movement. You will be the inheritor of all the history. You will still be the inheritor of the Wesleyan revival. And for me, that has been important. That drew me to the United Methodist Church. You will remain Armenian. You will remain tied to the creeds and to the doctrine of the church and the standards. All of those things that are in the Book of Discipline will remain. Your hymnology will remain the same. Not that you use a hymnal, we don't hear, but the songs that we sing, all of that will remain the same. The theology of the denomination will coalesce around a more progressive mainline stance. And you can look at other denominations in the mainline and kind of look and see what that looks like. But I think what it means is that the people called United Methodists are going to be more in step with one another. So if you remain in the United Methodist Church, you keep the denomination, you keep the marquee outside, so you have the same name, bank accounts, and there's less fighting. But is there less fighting? I'm hesitating on this because theoretically the conservatives and the progressives will not be there to fight each other. But there was a confirmation course many years ago, and there was a video in it, and one of the videos, somebody had prepared a claymation video, which was just awesome, and it was around the identity of the United Methodist Church. And one of the things that claymation was telling our kids was that fighting like cats and dogs is something that we do. So I'm not sure that's going to go away. That may be part of our DNA, but you get my point. So, theology. What about polity? What about the organization? Well, the organizational structure of your local United Methodist Church won't change at all. Neither will the larger denomination change. Elections to officers in your church will happen at charge conference, just like they always have. Elections for people serving in the larger church will remain the same. The boards and agencies that we are used to hearing about, the missional work of the church will remain the same. Names like UMCOR, in our case the Children's Home, UMW, all of that stays if you remain in the post-separation United Methodist Church. And I would assume that the relationships that we have with other Methodist central conferences, other Methodist denominations will remain as they have been. What about finances? Well, the structure of your budget will not change. Just the needs of the trustees, the staff parish, and all of that will remain the same, assuming that the membership of your church keeps giving, right? That is not a given in all of this. It's something that has to be considered. But anyway, the structure of it doesn't change. There are no penalties, which there are right now, if you are to leave the denomination. You don't have to pay your unfunded pension liabilities, at least up front. I'm not clear as to how any of us are paying those in the United Methodist Church today, but the imposition of paying that up front is there now. If you were going to leave the United Methodist Church, all that would continue. Apportionments would continue the same. You don't have to prepay any of those. As I think about apportionments, let me just say one thing. I think apportionments are going to change. They have to. But there's going to be a lag time of where the apportionments and the amount apportioned gets brought down to the ability of the local church to pay. And I don't know if I did that graphically enough for you, but the apportionments are chasing this downward trend, and they are behind it. The General Council of Finance Administration is proposing the lowest multiplier for apportionments that they have used in decades. And so there is an effort on the part of the the higher church to make those match. But the needs of the annual conference and needs of the Episcopal system and whatever, that's going to take a while to catch up with the lag of, say, your budget, but also the decline in the number of churches that are contributing to that, whether because they are closing or because they are moving, whatever. And that lag time may be a little uncomfortable. Our apportionments in 2022 are going to be higher than they were in 2021, even though our budget was lower in 21 than it was in 20. And anyway, there's going to be pressures that way that will continue. Let's not talk about apportionments, but appointments. If you remain in the United Methodist Church, when your pastor leaves for one reason or another, the bishop will continue to have the responsibility of fulfilling filling the pulpit in your church. That'll just remain the same. And the theology of the pastor that's coming in will more closely align with the pastor that's leaving. As the denomination coalesces around its theology, its brand recognition is going to be clearer, and the clergy will be more in step with one another. As I think about clergy, let me just say a word. I think this is addressed more to lay people. I want you to hear from a pastor, kind of where we're at. Today, the number of appointments that are available to us are less than they were 20 years ago, 30 years ago when I started. That is just taking its course going downhill. But that is going to be accelerated as we go into the post-United Methodist Church. And that weighs heavy on us as clergy. Lay people, you need to hear that. You need to know that we are just struggling with that. Now, I think there's going to be less clergy to be appointed, and so there is a concern for the local church as well. And nobody knows the math of this. And having been a district superintendent, sat on cabinets, appointing people, you stress about the math of supply and demand every year. But I think going forward, nobody can really know where all of this is going to land. But it does weigh heavy on us. On the LGBTQ side of things, I may have already addressed all of this, but I think that if you remain in the United Methodist Church, the language around LGBTQ ordination, weddings, is going to go away. And so the denomination will make continual efforts to make the denomination more affirming. And what happens to dissenting voices is going to be interesting. If you read the news, what makes the news hasn't been particularly kind to dissenting voices. I think that is probably going to depend on who the bishop is. And of course, bishops change over time. And so, as I'm thinking about this, let me go to the next section, which is pros and cons. And I think pros and cons depend on whether you are a conservative church or you're a progressive church, which way you're deciding you as a unit are going to go in all of this. If you are a conservative church and you remain in the United Methodist Church, the pros are, and I think I've gone over most of these already, you don't have to change your name, your bank account, your Sunday school class, all of that remains the same. You don't have to take any financial obligations on that you don't already have. Those just remain the same. And these are important things. The receiving of a pastor remains the responsibility of the bishop. You as a local church continue to receive pastors rather than having to go find pastors. That's something that we have not ever done and we're not used to and is not easy. And you as a conservative church in the post-separation United Methodist Church will continue to be in mission with whatever district missions you have been involved in, whatever conference missions or general church things you have done. Conversely, there are some disadvantages. If you're a conservative church and you're remaining in the United Methodist Church, the theology of the United Methodist Church is going to migrate farther and farther away from yours. The denomination will become not only more progressive, but I think it's going to become whiter and it's going to become older. And so if you remain in the United Methodist Church, you're going to be in a denomination that's more progressive, more white, and older. Why do I say that? I was the district superintendent of the most diverse district of the Florida Annual Conference, and we claim to be the most diverse one in all of Methodism. I don't know if that's true. But what I noticed was that the ethnic minority churches tended to have more families, more young people. And so those churches that were of color, a Haitian church, a Korean church, a Hispanic church, African American churches too, had more young people in them, and they are going to go, a lot of them are going to go, I think, with the Global Methodist Church. They are more conservative. And so when they leave, the younger people leave and the people of color leave. And we will be left with an older, whiter, more progressive United Methodist Church. And so this is my maybe next to last con in this. Whatever issues your church has with the denomination already, or with your annual conference, with your district superintendent, whatever discontent you have with the system, all of that will remain. None of the issues, say, around apportionments that we struggle with today are going to go away because we have settled the LGBTQ issue. And so that is something to consider. If you remain in the United Methodist Church, the malaise that exists now will be the malaise that is there later. If you're a conservative church remaining in the United Methodist Church, it will be harder and harder. It's happening already. Harder and harder for the cabinet to find a more conservative pastor to send your way to follow the one that you have. So the likelihood that you will receive someone who is more progressive than the congregation is going to increase as time goes on. If you are a progressive church and you are remaining in the post-separation United Methodist Church, the pros, I think, are very similar, right? You don't have to change your name. You don't have to change your bank account or your Sunday school class. You don't have to take on any financial obligations you don't already have. Your pastor will be supplied by the Episcopal office as always. The arguments around LGBTQ will have been settled. Weddings and ordination will be available to all. And theologically, the annual conference is going to align with your church closer and closer. It's just going to become a more your stances are going to be the same going forward. But there are cons to this. What I was saying before about the church becoming whiter and older, that diversity is something that we are proud of. It's something that we delight in when we go to district meetings and annual conference meetings and we just see all these different people. It's just a wonderful thing. And if they go away, being in an Anglo church right now, you're going to lose that. And that is not what a more progressive church is after. Likewise, as I said before, if you have any issues with apportionments or anything else that the annual conference does, those are going to remain the same. And one of the things that I have thought of in this vein is that as the funds for the annual conference decrease, the work that your annual conference, the denomination, does together is going to decrease. So advocacy work, where you accumulate a bunch of churches to do different things. We have advocacy days in Tallahassee. Those kind of things are going to decrease as the funds decrease. And so the things that are important to the local church are not going to have, at least they're not going to have the same support that they have had from the higher ups. I do believe that the list is shorter in the cons for a progressive church than it is for a conservative church. Listen, I've listed a variety of things here. I hope they're helpful in having discussions around these things, that it'll jog some things in your mind that will be helpful as you, and this is important, prayerfully consider what's going on. I want to beg you to bathe these things in prayer, because I don't think that the issue of the United Methodist Church lies around structure. If it was around structure, we would have figured that out and done something better. I don't even think it's around theology. I think that the issue for the United Methodist Church is a spiritual one, and it's only going to be solved spiritually. And so we need to hear from God. We need to see how we can get our preferences out of the way and insert what God wants us to do. And that can only be done in searching the scriptures, in prayer, and as United Methodists, we firmly believe that the will of God is found in conferencing. That's why we have a charge conference and an annual conference and all these conferences that we do, is because in listening to one another, we begin to discern the will of God. So my prayers are with you as we navigate these waters together. My church is in it. I am in it together as you are. May God bless you.